Hello friends, and welcome to my today's lecture, that is on the symbols in Anecdote of the Jar poem by Wallace Stevens. Friends, in my last lectures I spoke about the summary of this poem Anecdote of the Jar by Wallace Stevens, and also the various themes that are dealt with in the poem by Wallace Stevens. Today I'll be talking about the symbols that are used in this particular poem, and also various figures of speech or the literary devices like form, meter, and so on, and the rhyming scheme, etc. First, I'll be starting with the symbols. Now, the poem Anecdote of the Jar, when we read through this, as is clear in the title itself or in the very first line, the main thing which is talked about is the jar. Now this jar is very important to the poem, and many critics have also debated about actually what does a jar represent, or rather what does it symbolize, if it does symbolize anything. Now if we see it in very broad terms, we could say that the jar seems to represent humanity, because humanity, or rather human, or we could say more specifically the human civilization, because it is a man-made object. Now it also asserts a kind of strength over the Tennessee's wilderness, which forces, now this jar forces this wilderness to be no longer wild, in quotes, because at one level, if we see, the jar might represent the way the human is trying to civilize or dominate the nature or the natural world around it by cutting down the trees, or deforestation rather, in order to build cities, or by using natural resources to create the tools. This jar which is talked about, it may also evoke imagery, now which is related to factories, industrialization, and more materialistic things rather, like commodification, you could say. Now in reading the poem, the jar, which is a rigid and a standard object, which actually tames, or which domesticates the sprawling growth that surrounds it, the growth of the natural vegetation which surrounds the jar, and it may also represent that the way or the kind the modern society zaps life out of its spontaneity and freedom. And we all know that the jars are used to contain things which reflects this idea very well. And the jar that is placed there by the unknown writer, it is empty, without any substance in it, or meaning or creative power of its own. While we all know that nature can grow and breed, the jar cannot do anything on its own. It needs to be filled in by a human hand. And so we know that the presence of the jar is the presence of a human element into it. And this jar is also deemed as port in the air. At the end of the second paragraph, in line 8, And the sport is basically a transportation hub which reflects the idea that the jar is merely a vessel of sorts and something that we can use to fill something, fill it, or we may give meaning to it. But unlike the nature, this jar has no creative power of its own. And this imagery of jar has been repeated nearly in all the three paragraphs. And another symbol that we could talk about is nature, which is totally in contrast to the human object jar. Now, nature exhibits a literal presence in the poem itself, and at the same time, nature also seems to take a symbolic resonance. And we could, if you think of nature in the poem itself, nature could be thought of or could be talked of as representing creativity and creative inspiration. Now, these two things that the poem implies, the jar is devoid of, or the jar lacks these two things, that is creativity and creative inspiration. And the jar is, we know, it is solid, motionless, whereas nature in the poem is slovenly wilderness, as has been shown in the third line of the poem. Now, the word slovenly, it means very messy, and while wilderness is the opposite of civilization, and something that is untamed, sprawling, loose. If nature represents creativity, then the jar's dominion, the dominion of the jar, that is the nature itself, it represents humans' attempt to capture that creativity, such as by writing the kind of poem that has been done. And yet the speaker also implies that by capturing the creativity, human inevitably tries to tame it too, and leaving the wilderness no longer wild once it comes under the dominion of the jar. There is genuine creative freedom, which is perhaps incompatible with the orderly, rigid confines of the modern life, which is represented by the jar. And this idea gets echoed in the final stanza of the poem, when the speaker points out that it is a jar which is devoid of any creativity. And as nature does not give off bird or bush, the jar is absolutely dependent, or it is somebody else's creation, but nature itself creates. And the natural world, it can grow and breed in a way which the human-made objects cannot. And nature then could also be seen as a source of creative inspiration that humanity requires in order to fill its empty jars. And the jar is merely a port. We saw that it's a kind of transportation hub that creativity may pass through it. So these were the symbols that were talked about in the poem Anecdote of the Jar. And these two symbols of the jar and the nature, both were completely contrasted or juxtaposed to each other, representing creativity as well as creativity by the other hand, and one which could grow on its own. Now I'll be talking about one or two figures of speech, like the form. As far as the form in the poem is concerned, we see that it is a 12-line poem and it is split into three quadrants. And this steady, straightforward form, it feels very disarmingly simple. It is very simple, considering the ambiguous events that the poem describes. That's the part of the point. Things here, they are all about perspective, and there may be more content within these short lines than it actually meets the eye. By reading the title itself, we get a clue as to how to interpret what happens here in the poem, and especially this is an anecdote, a short, often amusing story which is told in a casual conversational tone. And their anecdotes are basically used to illustrate a point about something, though whatever point here is, it is up for debate. Now, the poem here is a casual anecdote, which also comically contrasts with more eyebrows, poetic forms like the ode. We've seen that this poem has been compared to Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, where the urn is represented as a jar here by Wallace Stevens. And the poem's form is actually slippery as the content itself, and it motivates us readers to ascribe some deeper meaning to what happens, and at the same time it presents itself as something very simple and straightforward, as is shown in the poem. Now, tomorrow or in my next lecture, I'll be talking about the meter and the rhyme scheme in the poem Anecdote of the Jar by Wallace Stevens. That's all for now.